Hello everybody. Good morning. My name is Araba Aduapau. I'm the Senior Research Specialist at Ujima Inc., the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. Thank you for tuning in to our DVAM webinar series. This is going to be an amazing presentation by Nish Newton. I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit more about Nish Newton. So Nish Newton is a catalyst for radical imagination and healing-centered liberation. Their work is informed by our elders in old ways while also being guided by our descendants and the new ways of future generations. Nish is a Black, queer, trans survivor of sexual and domestic violence among a myriad of other identities and lived experiences. They utilize their background as a historian, sociologist, and creative artist to wage a better world. To mobilize communities toward the world they envision, Nish earned an MA graduate degree in social justice and human rights. Their most recent accomplishments is developing a program that fully funds gender-affirming healthcare for Black trans people throughout their home state. Their distinct approaches have led them to facilitate prominent social justice spaces alongside beacons of transformative change like Sonia Renee Taylor, Adrienne Mari Brown, and Dr. Angela Davis. When Nish isn't mobilizing communities toward a more equitable and liberated world, they spend their time with beloved friends, cooking with their wife, reclaiming peace on the New Orleans porch, writing poetry, and finding innovative ways to be a menace, to colonial oppression. I love that so much. That is awesome.
Thank you. I love it too.
We're so excited to have you on, Nish. This conversation is long awaited on Black Trans Aliveness. So please feel free to take the floor. And just a reminder to those in the chat, if you do have any questions that may pop up at any time of the presentation, feel free to write them in the chat and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. But all right, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. I've got two screens up here as well that I'm speaking to both of. So on one, I'll be really specifically trying to watch the chat box for you to utilize. And on this one, I'll be speaking at you and sharing my slides. I am really excited to be here with this workshop today. And I also know that it's being recorded to be shared out later. So I'm also very excited and thankful for the future folks that I get to engage in this conversation. The conversation itself is Amplifying Black Trans Aliveness. And it's a conversation that I've had a few times this year, specifically around survivors, but I've also been able to have this conversation in different perspectives in life. Like I was working with a cohort of massage therapists earlier this year, talking about body work and massage therapy, but also there was a grocers co-op that I was working with this year. So all different audiences, and of course, y'all now. And I know that this conversation can be had in any space. So that's why I've been trying to get it anywhere I can get it. But it's a conversation I also think we can have in every space. So whoever you are, however you enter the world, however you enter the space, I know that this conversation is meant for you. And I'm very excited. I know that for whatever reason you were called to enter this space. So I'm excited to lean into it together today. Throughout our conversation, we're going to be talking about living into your roles for our collective liberation. I think that everybody has a role in revolution. I think that everybody has a role in our liberation, a world where we can be more safe and more healed and more thriving. But I also know that we're not single dimensional people who live single dimensional lives. So I say roles in the sense with like a little S, because I really think that some of us might find one really distinct way that we can show up for Black trans folks, but we also might find that there's many ways that we show up. So this entire space today is finding the way or the many ways that we show up. And by the end of it, everybody's gonna leave with at least one goal for something you can do effective immediately for Black trans communities. I know that we've had a little overview about who we are and what we're doing today, but getting more into the nitty gritty, my name is Nish. I use they, them pronouns. And I'm coming in today specifically with my educational background, my lived experience, and then my own identities. I have so much history and sociology in my educational background, so it's also going to show up in this presentation. I'm really excited to share a couple of historical analyses with y'all, but also just some of the socio-political data that I've been able to find, because I think that there's not ready information about that when you go ahead and try to seek it out. But I also am bringing my experience in. In my bio, it discloses that I am a survivor of sexual and domestic violence, but I also currently work for the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. And I've been doing anti-violence work there for the last couple of years, sharing community with them for the last decade or so. I also work on behalf of an organization that is called the Black Liberation Collective, and that's the group that I'm able to do gender affirming care with throughout Idaho, throughout my home state. But identity, if you haven't clocked it already, I'm a Black trans person speaking on behalf of my own lived experiences and identities, but also from the identities of folks that I share beloved community with. Ujima is here on the tech team. They're going to be helping me out if there's any support that y'all might need. If there's any questions you have about accessibility or any accommodations we can provide in the chat, they're the folks that you can call on for some support. And then together with all of us, we're going to go ahead and offer some information together. I'm going to facilitate a couple activities with y'all. So I encourage you to get something to write with, whether that's like a phone notepad, whether that's an actual notepad and a piece of pencil or a piece of paper and a pencil. But whatever that might be, when we're going to do some activities together before we wrap up this space so that we can develop some roles and goals for Black trans aliveness. I say this term already. I think I probably said Black trans aliveness some 20, 30 times already, but I'm going to continue to say it a lot in this space because I want it in this space and I want it in the world. But before we get too carried away, I want to make sure we actually know what this term means and to make sure that we're offering a definition into this space. When I'm talking about Black trans aliveness, I'm talking about all sorts of things. And I invite y'all to put some things in the chat about what you think I might be referring to there. I know that Black trans folks, a lot of times in our society, are indexed to like death and doom and destruction, but Black trans aliveness can be rest, it can be safety, it can be ease. In the chat box, I'd love for you to drop a couple more things that Black trans aliveness might be. We have freedom and joy. I think that those are really important outcomes for our aliveness. I also like to think of like abundance. I think of abundance in terms of like the possibilities that we have, but also the resources that support us. Visibility, yes, and more than basic needs met. I love that. Not just simply like the bare minimum, but the things that we need in order to live a very vibrant life. Community, yes, absolutely. The experiences of community, the wisdom of community, the love of community, the keys of community. Travel, experiencing the body in harmony, mind, food, culture, representation, dreaming opportunity. Yes, it's all of those things. It's all of those things. And I think that all of these things exist in glimmers. They already exist. I think one of the constant themes of this workshop is that like, we're not necessarily creating anything new. We're just creating more space for each of these things. Yes. All right, keep this chat active. I'm gonna go ahead and move us along, but I think that all of these things that you're naming in this space are absolutely a part of the workshop. Living your full self, empowerment, advocacy, living in a world where people aren't trying to compartmentalize us and saying that I love you in spite of. The way I would describe it for folks who are newer to this or for some of these concepts in the chat that aren't quite making sense yet, I would describe Black trans aliveness as something that is the liberation and the thriving of the folks who are living at the intersections of both race and gender. We're talking about minoritized communities today, and we're a lot of times when we're talking about Black trans folks, talking about folks who are living at the intersections of the most marginalized at the most marginalized. And this is all about their wellness. This is about their liberation and thriving. So I feel like that's something that's important. I feel like that's something that's always a radical act whenever we center folks who are at the margins of the margins. So some community agreements to grant us into the space today. If you need some quick clarity about a particular term that I'm saying, or just in general, some of the things that I'm describing, or if there's an accommodation that we can meet, please share it in the chat box in real time. And I'll be watching that, and the Ujima tech team will be watching that. I also invite y'all to take a bio break if you need to, if you need some water, if you need some food, if you need to go ahead and stretch outside for a minute, I welcome you to do that because we're talking about liberation in this space. And I wholly, wholly, wholly believe we got to model it in this space, that we're taking care of ourselves and each other. So us practicing that in real time only helps Black trans aliveness. So please aid the presentation by getting a little snack or making yourself some tea or whatever you need. And then lastly, probably the most important, if you're here to challenge race and gender and not yourself, I invite you to leave. And by that, I really mean that if you're here to question whether Black Lives Matter or not, or the validity and existence of trans communities, this is not the space for you. And I'm sure that there's other spaces that welcome you in the learning that you're on in your journey. But if this is a space where you're trying to challenge the existence and the experiences of people living through race and gender, rather than trying to lean into curiosity and develop better practices for yourself and the folks around you, I invite you to just like raise your hand, shut your laptop, turn off your computer, and go ahead and just, we're gonna catch up a different day, a different time. If all of those are understood in the chat box, I would love if you could just put like a period, exclamation point, smiley face, whatever. And if there's any other community agreements you feel like are essential for this space, I invite you to put that in the space as well. Period. I love that. Wonderful. And I'll be watching if there's any agreements that pop up in your mind throughout this space. I welcome you to bring that in as well. I think that we can really lean into collective care of this space. All right, let's get into it. That was enough prefacing. We're gonna go ahead and start with some information before we do some activities, and then I'm gonna grind us out with our final goal. Today, I'm gonna be talking about 8 different dimensions of aliveness. These are 8 different ways that I've categorized the ways that all of us need aliveness, but specifically where Black trans folks need some aliveness garnered. We've got educational well-being, emotional well-being, environmental well-being, financial well-being, physical well-being, social well-being, spiritual well-being, and vocational well-being. I'm going to be talking about each of these in as much detail as I can for about the next half hour or so. And again, I want you to take as many notes as you can. I want this to be something that you're filling out a page or two. Not that, again, that you need to get every single piece of information written down, but anything that's talking to your spirit, I want you to write down so that when we're finding our role or our goal at the end of this, you have something to reference or something that you feel like is something you've intentionally thought about. And each of these, I'm going to give you 2 examples of what we need for Black trans aliveness, things that are preventing Black trans aliveness from taking root. And then I'm going to offer a solution that I've written in my own margins at some point of this. I'm going to invite y'all to go ahead and write one of your own solutions as well. So we've got a couple ideas to reference on both ends. And the first one we're going to start with is emotional. Oh, educational. All right, y'all. So at the intersections of race and gender or more, I know that Black trans aliveness is interrupted by microaggressions and violence in school policy and culture. Now, I know that in terms of culture, I can think of so many ways that show up in our school systems or just in our learning patterns. So that could mean how we're receptive to new ideas, how we respond to being challenged, whether in like small interpersonal conversation or in bigger dialogues in classroom settings. But I also know that the school cultures could mean things like who gets to be popular or respected in a school. If there are spirit weeks in a school, what kind of ideas do we draw upon? What kind of stereotypes and tropes do we uphold? They're like, I know that, like, for example, it's kind of like homecoming season right now. Who is allowed to be homecoming royalty and what kind of culture do we have around that? But also very quite literally in the policy and in the things that are written down educationally that we uphold. So I also think of examples that we need to confront and correct in our policy, such as things, it could be language just as upholding a gender binary. For example, I know that a lot of the policy that I review will say something like, if a teacher needs time off, he or she may request blah, blah, blah. Even in the language that upholds a gender binary, which is really exclusive and harmful for folks. But I also know in terms of policy, that could be things in terms like where students can use the restroom or which accommodations can be met for them if they are a trans or gender expansive person. Um, and of course, there's policy about like what we learn and how we learn, which brings me to my next point. I know that there's a lot of policy and curriculum that completely omits Black trans communities in general. And I know that our curriculum just needs a bigger review than just this conversation, because I know that in my Black experience, if I had been navigating the curriculum that we face in this nation, I would truly believe that my Black ancestors started in chains and that our history only began some 400 years ago. But I also know, in terms of erasure and curriculum, I would also be waiting to this day to actually learn about a trans person in any capacity in a school setting because of our curriculum or the policy that binds us to curriculum. I think that all of these things need to change. That's exactly how Black trans aliveness is interrupted. But if I had to offer a solution of my own, I would say that something that you can do or consider is to engage with your alma mater, the school that you graduated from, the school that you represent, the folks that you come from, or the closest school to your house, or the closest school to a loved one. Maybe you got some little children in your life. Showing up for them and making sure that Black trans aliveness is something that is honored and protected there. Now, very small here, I've got my own notes for my own margin. So I invite you to write down whatever feels resonant with you. But some of the things when I think really specifically about like how we can actualize this world, and not just like as a concept and not just as a like utopian dream, some of the things I know we can do in real time and some of the things we can commit ourselves to is supporting pro-Black, pro-trans folks, whether those are teachers or school board members or staff. That could mean supporting CRT, critical race theory initiatives. I know that that's something that a lot of us have heard about. That's a buzzword that's been showing up. But we can also show up for things like comprehensive sex ed. We need to know about sex education that encompasses all of us and without stigma and without centering these purity standards that don't serve us and have never reflected Black folks nor trans folks. I also know that we need to support some policies that protect students, like those that stop criminalizing students, and policies that foster safer spaces like gender-free restrooms. Take some notes here. We're gonna go ahead and move to the next one, emotional. But I want you to again remember that in all of these, I'm talking about the intersections of race and gender. But in all of these examples that I'm using and in all of these solutions that I'm posing to y'all, it's very likely that there are Black trans students who have a disability, who face poverty. And I want you to go ahead and think of the intersections as you're thinking about these solutions that serve all of us and that welcome all Black trans aliveness. Emotional, let's get into it. At the intersections of race and gender or more, Black trans aliveness is interrupted by the uninformed and ignorant comments of other people. And I feel like I wrote that in the most shadiest of all moods. But I think that there's something that I feel like shows up most loudly in the day-to-day lived experience of our Black trans community members. And by this, it could mean things like folks thinking that they have some knowledge or baseline to share, but in fact, they're just really not well versed or storied to any Black trans people. So they're speaking in a place of true uninformedness with this notion that they got some power behind what they're saying and that it needs to be heard and spread into the world. But there are also just really ignorant and insensitive comments that we dig through. I can't tell you how many times I'm just like trying to see what my siblings are doing on the gram. And as I'm clicking through people's stories, it's just like hatred for no reason, just unsolicited, unprovoked harm that we're going through. But when I talk about the emotional toll of this and just some of the experiences that I want to name that are very common for Black trans folks to navigate, I think that this is something that has to be addressed with just the way that we've been talking about trans communities in the last couple of years. So I always bring the example of the rise in anti-trans initiatives when I'm talking about the emotional toll this takes. On this PowerPoint presentation, there's a graph and it shows a stack of different bill amounts that have happened over the last few years attacking trans and genderqueer people. It shows in 2019 that there were 19 bills that were introduced, which I would argue already from its inception at this graph, 19 bills is far too many. We know that in these bills that are being introduced, the people who are going to be most impacted, the people who are going to be most targeted when it comes to enforcement, are going to be Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks, particularly Black folks, because of the history of this nation. But the following year in 2019, there was a rise, there was an increase in 25 bills. By 2020, this was the first year that I had entered working in the legislative sessions to confront these. There were 60 bills, and y'all, I'm telling you, it felt like we were fighting for our lives. There were so many bills, and they were coming from all sorts of directions, playing on all sorts of things, and we were inundated by it. So it just blows my mind to think of by 2021, the following year, how there was more than double that. There was 131 bills produced and presented to basically criminalize, attack, and prevent trans people from growing old and being able to access any sort of care or housing or support in their lives. By 2022, there was 155 bills. But in the chat box, I'm curious about how many bills that you expect, just because you've been living in the same world that I've been living in. How many bills you think that you could expect from 2023? These are the numbers from the previous years. How many think you've been facing this year? You've got 300 plus, 200, 200, 300. Yeah, anywhere between 200 to 300 would absolutely make sense with this data. Of course, it wouldn't make sense in actuality. Lots of 200s, 300s, 300s plus. There was over 570 this year. I think the last time I checked, it was 573. And so, of course, this adds to the people in their ignorant comments. Everybody thinks that they're a spokesperson on this. There are so many things that are coming up and the testimonies for these bills, and just even in the written explicit language of these bills that are really harmful. And they're stated as if they are true, when they're stated as if there's any sort of social backing or scientific backing to them. And that takes a huge emotional toll to see this on the mass scale, especially on the national stage that it's been on. But when I'm talking about the emotional effect on this, I also think it's important to address the suppression of these feelings. It's not like there are many supportive outlets for Black trans people to go to. I think that a lot of times family can be really complex. I think that our greater communities, there's a lot of transphobia in Black communities. There is so much racism in many trans communities. When we try to go find like emotional support, if we go to counseling or therapy, there's literally just on probably one hand, maybe two, a number of Black trans therapists. And of course, there are folks who are Black who offer gender affirming care, and trans folks who offer very anti-racist services. But in so many ways, there's still ways that people are falling short in immeasurable possibilities. And so, of course, we're here to confront that, and we're here to address that today. So some of the solutions I would pose are just in general promoting collective care and not self-care. So when your margins interpret what that means and some of the feelings that you're thinking, and some of the ways that you think that you can show up for this emotional toll and the causes of it. But if I had to offer some of the things I scribble in my own margins, I would say that it's really important for you to interrupt harmful behavior before it affects a Black trans person, whether that's IRL in real life, whether that's on Instagram, whether you're commenting back, sending the DMs, messaging the auntie that you know you need to get collected before a friend shows up, or if harm has happened, responding to that harm so that a Black trans person has to carry less of that labor. I also think that there's other things that we can do for the emotional well-being, for amplifying Black trans aliveness, such as sponsoring therapy sessions for folks who are Black and trans. One of my favorite groups, Equitable CC, is a counseling group that if you like literally just send them money on Venmo and you're like, I want to support Black trans sessions, they'll go ahead and find Black trans folks that can get that session. And I think that that's a really simple and direct way that we don't have to create a whole new world or system for. It's like a world and a system that we're already using and living through. Go ahead and write your final notes for what you think that you can personally do for Black trans aliveness and anything else that feels resonant from this slide. And I'm gonna go ahead and take us to environmental. At the intersections of race and gender or more, Black trans aliveness is interrupted by the impacts of the climate crisis. I'm an environmentalist. I feel like I'm always in my reduce, reuse, recycle bag. But I know that it's also bigger than that and holding folks accountable who are able to impact the climate in ways that none of us individually can, like the billionaires and the folks who produce things in mass, such as Amazon or other companies that we can hold accountable. I know that when there is a climate crisis, whether it's a hurricane, whether it is a wildfire, whether it's a tsunami, whether it's just the water droughts, the saltwater contamination that I've been experiencing here in New Orleans, I know that all of the impacts of the climate crisis are going to be disproportionately felt by Black trans folks, and the impacts on our lives are going to change basically at the inception of these climate crises. So, and I know when I'm talking about environmentalism, I'm not having two separate conversations about race and gender and the things that we need to do for the climate crisis. I think that we all can find new and inventive ways to deepen our accountability to preventing and responding to the climate crisis that we're navigating, and all of them. But besides environment, in terms of Mama Nature and Mother Earth, I also think that it's very important for us to talk about gentrification. I know that Black and trans folks have been pushed out of society, oftentimes pushed out of our homes and families, out of economic opportunities, and so many things that I'm going to speak about in this space. But gentrification is how we were pulled out of our homes and pulled out of the communities that provide for us, and that we're able to seek refuge. So if I had to offer solutions for this, I would say that it's important for you to radicalize your commitment to a healthy and intentional environment around you and the communities that you come from. So again, scribbling in my own margins, the things that feel really loud for me to say to y'all are making eco-friendly considerations. Yes, even when it's not convenient, but also making it a principle to yourself, but also to others, to be a steward and a decolonizer of the land around you. Because I know that the violence that we do to the land and the spaces around us mirrors the violence that we experience as Black trans folks. And I invite you in your own margins to go ahead and write down a few ideas or notes that might seem really loud for me. All right, let's keep it pushing to financial. This is a slide, y'all. I always really got to contain myself. I be going on my financial TED Talks. I'm ready. I'm ready to like dismantle capitalism in one 90-minute workshop. So I'm gonna do my best to keep it pushing through this slide in particular. But I think it's one that is very, very loud in the ways that it shows up and our access to all of these other dimensions of aliveness in so many ways, especially because we live in the capitalist nation that we do. At the intersections of race and gender or more, Black trans aliveness is interrupted by a lack of opportunities for generational wealth. I've said a few times in this presentation already, just the ways that trans folks especially are oftentimes, because of stigma and shame from their family members, pushed away from the opportunities for stability and well-being that come from collectives. But I also would be completely remiss to say the financial burdens that we need to address if I wasn't going to talk about this through a racialized lens. So for this, I call upon my favorite historian, one of my favorite writers, Ta-Nehisi Coates. They say that the income gap between Black and white households is roughly the same today as it was in 1970. Patrick Sharkey, who is a sociologist at New York University, studied children born from 1955 through 1970 and found that 4% of whites and 62% of Black communities across America had been raised in poor neighborhoods. A generation later, the same study showed that virtually nothing had changed. Now, there's so many things, of course, financially that we can deduce from this conversation and so many things we can draw out from this paragraph alone. But one of the things that always feels so loud to me when I think about this data and how it shows up for Black communities is that, of course, this doesn't even encompass the genderqueer folks in our communities. This is just pulling from the mode of our people, the most occurring of our people. We know that, again, folks who are gender expansive are of the most minoritized and marginalized groups of Black communities. But something that I also deduce from this data is that I feel like very, very regularly when we're talking about financial inequity, because we live in a capitalist system that serves none of us, when we talk about this, people across race really think that they understand it. And so when I'm talking about the financial gap, I'm really putting a lot of the labor of this financial gap and the things we need for Black trans aliveness on my non-Black folks, particularly my white counterparts. Because everyone I would agree with that I've met in my lifetime will say that I grew up poor or that I grew up with some sort of financial struggle or strain. And what I deduce from this is about 62% of the time, that's going to be accurate for Black communities, and about 4%, which I must have met the entire 4% of white communities who would say the same. So again, a lot of the labor when I'm talking about what needs to be remedied is coming from white folks. So if this is somebody, if you identify in this space as a white person, I really would love to challenge you for your role or goal to be about a financial aspect of Black trans aliveness. But Ta-Nehisi Coates continues on to say in the same excerpt talking about this study, that whereas whites who were born into affluent neighborhoods tended to remain in that affluent neighborhood or one that was adjacent to that same white neighborhood, Black folks tended to fall out of them. But he says that this is not surprising because Black families, regardless of their income, are significantly less wealthy than white families. He calls upon the Pew Research Center to estimate that white households are worth roughly 20 times as much as Black households. This slide has particularly been talking about wealth so far. But Ta-Nehisi Coates differentiates wealth from income, which I think is very important when we're talking about this as well. And when I think about the ways that Black trans people are able to go ahead and access income, like your paycheck, that's your month-to-month earnings that you bring in, it's essential for us to talk about the unsafe working cultures that we navigate. And I know that many Black trans folks, if they are in the professional setting, I put that in air quotes, that a lot of us find ourselves in different social justice organizations. We find ourselves in different nonprofits, and a lot of these spaces do feel more affirming because the communities are typically more mindful of our lived experiences. But I will also say with my whole chest, and probably on behalf of every Black trans person that I know, that these also are like unsafe working cultures, working systems, and that it's not just because you come from a social justice org are you immune from any of this, or just because you come from a space that is overall inclusive that you are immune to needing to the transphobia and the racism that we navigate, and that you are not responsible for amplifying more Black trans aliveness in the spaces that you work. So some solutions that I pause for this are investing, and not as a metaphor, in Black trans aliveness. More specifically, protecting Black trans youth and making sure that they have resources and opportunities to break a lot of these generational financial curses that we're inheriting. But also to share your income and your wealth with Black trans people. This is where I always like to jokingly but very seriously drag folks and remind them that this doesn't mean that if you've got like the extra cabin or whatever, you've got like a secondary home because your income and wealth provides for it, that doesn't mean that you're allowing Black trans folks to like stay there occasionally as like a little homie hookup. That means like seeding the land. That means like breaking the curse overall and like being radically committed to what this world is, not dabbling in. But this could also mean recruiting and retaining Black trans people in all sectors of your work, not just as an intern, not just as folks at lower levels of your organization, of your work sector, and compensating them generously wherever they are hired in. But also financially, I think that it's like beyond work. So I also like to tell folks it's not that deep, it's not that serious. Next time you go to drag brunch, bring some extra ones, whatever it might be. Like there's always ways that you can go ahead and push funds out in real time that doesn't require like an entire systemic analysis of your workplace. Let's keep it pushing. Write whatever else you need to in your margins about financial well-being. And I'm gonna go ahead and get into physical well-being. At the intersections of race and gender or more, Black trans aliveness is interrupted by our response to public health crises. This could mean, I think many of us probably immediately think of COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic that we're going through. But this could mean any of the other outbreaks that we're navigating. This could mean public health crises like our response to HIV. This could be public health crises in terms of the things in our air. This could be if there's toxic soils in your communities, our responses to those. Again, the violence that we experience in our land and in the world around us is felt and it's showcased on Black trans bodies disproportionately and acutely. but also, of course, medical discrimination. If we are responding to, we're trying to prevent the public health crises and the physical toll that takes on our bodies, we are so often met with medical discrimination. Medical discrimination in terms of a majority of Black doctors still to this day believe that Black people just feel pain differently. Medical discrimination in terms of trans people being unable to receive gender affirming care, or if they do, that they must jump through 30 more hoops than any other person would have to just for the same level of care. Um, there's so many ways that we could get into medical discrimination. And at the end of this, I'll offer some resources for like continued learning. Medical discrimination is one that is also very important to me, especially in the work that I do and in the experiences that I've had. But in the handout, I invite you to learn more about medical discrimination and continue your learning besides just the few examples that I'm sharing here. So my solution I pose to y'all is centering the needs of Black trans people in our conversations about disease, nutrition, health, but more specifically to contribute to relief funds and to raise awareness efforts, or whatever you can do to combat public health crises. That also means accompanying Black trans relatives and loved ones for medical appointments, knowing the things that we know about how doctors oftentimes treat us and the ways the medical world oftentimes views us. Being there to be an advocate can be something that's really, really meaningful if your Black trans relatives and loved ones are open to that. And like somebody already said in the chat, like not only meeting our basic needs, but advancing gender affirming care. Like, yes, I want access to gender affirming care, but I want it to be accessible. I want public health to be accessible. I want it to be something that is not something that could be a possibility. I want it something that's readily available for us. I want it something that folks can get the things that they need to in real time without having to have a just cause or a righteous legacy for all of the traumas that they are now deserving of. I invite you to go ahead and write some roles and goals that might feel important for physical well-being, for Black trans aliveness. And I'm gonna go ahead and get into the social well-being. In order for Black trans aliveness to take root and to stop being interrupted, it's important that we interrupt fetishization and appropriation. Whew, I could get into so many things with this. Black trans folks are exoticized, they're fetishized. This is something that absolutely happens in the legacy of colonialism that we face. So we need to stop that. We need to address that. We need to understand that our bodies and ourselves will never be safe in a world where we're fetishizing Black folks and trans folks, specifically Black trans folks. But there's also appropriation that happens all of the time. And I know that from slang, specifically slang. I think we all share the same internet, but just the appropriation of our culture, the proximity that people think that they have to these spaces because they watch Pose or because they like Beyonce's Renaissance. There's so many ways that we need to be socially accountable and just cognizant of the roots of these things and the impacts of these things. Socially, I feel like I love to get into a very, very macro space and talk about like the big scale. I like to talk about the forest, but not really about the trees. So I also really want to talk about some of the more specific examples in this. And I think one way I start to get closer to that is as we talk more and more about like how we're compartmentalized as Black trans people, having to be in spaces of our Black siblings, but realize that we're not truly welcome there, and that we have to compartmentalize our transness or our gender fluidity or gender queerness or agenderness somewhere else. But also in our trans communities, recognizing that there's so much anti-Blackness and racism that still stems and that still benefits. So I feel like there's so many ways that we're compartmentalized, and that shows up in our day-to-day life in so many ways. And I really want to hone more into that actually in the spiritual slides. So I'm going to get there, but I also know that this means that this is actually you, not just as like you as a member of our community and you as a member of our nation. This also means how you wage support and conversations in your own friendships, with your own family members, in your own workplaces. This is something that is very, very much so micro and individualized as well. So some of the solutions that I pose for you and you specifically, but also you and the greater collective of people that we come from, it's our role to call up harmful behaviors and culture vultures and things that are just serving toxicity to the foundation of Black trans folks. This could mean that you're correcting stolen slang. I don't think you could say that. Or you could even just ask more honestly and earnestly, do you know the root of where that came from and like what the meaning of that really is? I can't tell you how many times that people will be like, that's a kiki. It's not a kiki. That was a business meeting. That was a Zoom. That was not a kiki. Like we don't have to take that slang. We don't have to do that. We don't have to prey upon Black trans people in the ways that we do. This could be used socially uplifting intersectionality. This could mean remembering that racism and transphobia are not the sharks in the water that we're swimming through. They are the water. This is not the few and far between. Racism and transphobia are the norm and the default in our country, but it's not always been that way, and it will not always have to be that way. We have a social responsibility to understand that our entire social world is racist and transphobic, but it's very particular to this blip in time. Now, spiritually, at the intersections of race and gender or more, Black trans aliveness is interrupted by the people and the systems that mask their bigotry as religion. And this can feel really complex to a lot of folks, but I think it's rather simple. There are folks of all religious groups and all sorts of spiritualities that are Black and that are trans. And so if there's a particular idea or an entity or an institution believes that Black people or trans people are inferior in any way, shape, or form, that is their own bigotry being masked through that religion and through that system. I would also say it's really important for us to interrupt the lack of safety that exists for travel and Black trans folks. And I think that travel connects a lot to spirituality because of the experiences that come from that, because of some of the pilgrimages that are possible for Black and trans communities, but also in being able to return to the places where many of us come from, or to be able to return to the places that are spiritually aligned with us. And in this society, in our entire world, it's very difficult for Black trans people to have access to that travel or to be able to navigate and migrate in the ways that they need to for their spiritual practices because of the history and because of the legacy of white supremacy and colonialism. Specifically, that shows up today as racism and transphobia. And this is where it feels really big and conceptual. So I invite you to ask questions later when we're doing the question and answer about how this shows up. But how I like to exemplify this from history and how it shows up today is like, for example, West Africa is something that is very, very important to Black folks in the United States because it's where many of our ancestors were pulled from and stolen during the transatlantic slave trade. If we were to return to the same countries that birthed us, the same exact nations and the same exact regions that created Blackness and transness and all of these things that we come from and our heritage, today they now embody racism, colorism, white supremacy, transphobia, homophobia, all of these sentiments that are no longer ours because of the ways that white supremacy and colonization have trickled down. So although I would like to return home and to be able to connect with my roots, both my roots in terms of my race and my roots in terms of my gender, it would be very difficult for me to do so. And I wouldn't have the systems in this nation to do so easily because of that. So spirituality, I feel like, is very important because a lot of the spirituality that we know and a lot of the political world that we know and a lot of the social world that we know was created by some spiritual legacy and some religious conquest that started when people were coming out to find the new world and putting our ancestors in chains. And I know this, it's not just me like becoming a hotep before your eyes. I know this from like a very historical and social analysis because one of the things that I did in my research was reading the diaries of colonizers. I don't know why I did it. It took a lot of therapy, it took a lot of tea, it took a lot of sitting outside, giving myself like massages to shake this from my bones. But I think that this was very important to my understanding of how all of these ideas connect and really just like on a timeline, how this led to this, led to this, led to this. So if I had to use one singular example from this, I would tell you the story of somebody named Victoria. Victoria was a Black trans woman who lived initially in Benin, and she was stolen from enslavers and brought up to Portugal in the mid 1550s. I believe she was born in like the 1530s. And Victoria in Portugal was starting to get all sorts of documents written about her. And the image that's to the right hand of the screen is one of the documents that I read and sifted through. And this document basically is one of the many pieces of paper that were written about Victoria and the way that she was showing up in Portugal. And these documents basically showed that she was getting a lot of popularity and a lot of attention in this new environment that she was taken to. And that even as an enslaved woman, that people were admiring her beauty, that she was getting the attention of people of high social orders. Basically, she was disrupting the social order, and all of the enslaver, white, cis het folks that were around her were really starting to point her out as like a community pillar, a community cornerstone. Some people say it's because of her beauty and her beauty alone, and the way that she wore her head wraps and her garments and her character. There are other narratives that talk about her as a sex worker and the power and the status and the influence and the money that she was getting from that. But regardless, tales were being told about Miss Victoria until the new world basically was like, this is pushing against the social world that we're pushing, that we're creating and developing here. This is pushing against the religious norms that we are trying to enforce and maintain here. And if we're going to have this new society where order is this way and goodness is this way and power is this way, Miss Lady Victoria and anybody who is like Miss Lady Victoria needs to be stopped. This is challenging everything that it is that we know. And so the papers continue, the narratives about her continue all the way until she is put on trial. She is basically accused of being like an abomination to the world and being an abomination to the religious order that was being laid in Portugal. But more specifically, she was accused of this because she was accused of not being a woman. They shamed her in the ways that many of us are shamed. They shamed her in a lot of the ways that our current day legislators want to do to young folks to prove that they can participate in the sports that they want to play in. And ultimately, one of the things that Victoria did in this trial to defend herself was essentially saying, like, I'm completely normal. I'm completely beautiful. I am a dime a dozen from the people that I come from. But you stole me. And in this world and in this society you're creating, you're essentially trying to say that I don't exist. But like my people do exist. And I am one of many. And that I am not an abomination. It's the culture that you're creating. It is the religious ideologies that you're putting into these people that are the abomination. And of course, I'm romanticizing. I don't have the documents in front of me. I wish that I could do it more justice. But again, I encourage you to do more research into her. But I use Victoria as an example, not because she is the first Black trans woman that's documented in history, but because this is the first time that we really start to see us being criminalized and persecuted because of our identity. This is one of the first times that we start to see like a legal precedent or a social order of what will happen to other people who are like us or other people who are Black and trans. But in the same era, there's also people like Eleno or Elena, who is somebody who traveled throughout masculinity and femininity throughout different parts in their life. I think that Elena was from Spain. Um, there are people who were found in the South America as we now know it. There are people throughout India. There are people all throughout the entire world, throughout all periods of time, who are Black and trans. And I think that it's really important for us to know that the root of that and the divine that we come from and the divine that created us, they didn't just put us all throughout the world happenstance. Now, spirituality, there's so many things that I can recommend and so many things that I can offer from this conversation. But if I had to post something to you for your role or goal, I would say that it's important for you to confront or even to leave a harmful church. and to support or even sponsor in full a travel fund that removes the barriers for people to tap into their spiritual practices or their homeland. This could mean anything as specific to pointing at the hypocrisy and false religious claims, or developing relationships with really affirming and really intersectional religious groups. This could mean preventing conversion therapy, doing anything you can to make sure that folks know you can't pray the gay away, but also stop giving money to companies that invest in bigoted legislation abroad. So I mean that for things like Chick-fil-A, Hobby Lobby, groups that model themselves as very religious entities and business friends, and that's why people often shop with them to be in alignment with them. But those companies also in West Africa and throughout many of our homelands are the ones who are championing the same legislation that we're facing here on a worser scale that prevents same-sex marriages, that promotes all LGBTQIA people from receiving the affirming love that they historically had on their land. Now write down whatever roles and goals feel resonant from there, and I'm gonna go ahead and get into our last one, which is vocational, before we get into some activities. At the intersections of race and gender, or more, I know that Black trans aliveness is interrupted by the delegitimization of untraditional work. And earlier I had talked about like a lot of the ways that we show up in a professional sense and how many Black trans folks will find themselves in an organization that feels as closely aligned to their identities as and their safety as they can be. But I also know that not many of us have access to these professional spaces. And these professional spaces, again, actually aren't safe and affirming for so many of us. So we oftentimes will find ourselves in untraditional work. That could mean that we are actors, poets, creatives, people who get paid under the table, people who do sex work, whatever it might be. A lot of these kinds of works and a lot of these vocations are delegitimized, which of course just makes us more attached to stigma, shame, powerlessness, harm, violence, all of the things that trickle out from these outcomes. So I think that it's important for us to talk about legitimizing the work that we do and honoring all of the ways that Black trans people provide for themselves and making sure that we can do that in safe, abundant, thriving ways. But I think it's also important for us to confront, for Black trans aliveness, this notion of last to hire, first to fire, which is something that is a tale as old as time to many Black and trans folks. But for folks who might be newer to this concept, I would describe it as if there is a hiring process, you're going to be the last person that finds out that they're hiring. The ways that they're promoting this, the networks that they're telling, hey, you should apply to this, are not going to include you until we change that. This could also mean you make it all the way through the interview process, but when it came down to you and another candidate, something, quote unquote, in air quotes, something about the other candidate was just more desirable and felt closer in line. Of course, that needs to change. There's also this idea to first to fire. Oh, well, there's time for layoffs, our budget. We've been having feedback that somebody has an issue. The first one to fire is very oftentimes Black trans people rather than other folks, regardless of the work, the same kind of things that we bring into our vocational spheres. And of course, that needs to be confronted and corrected for Black trans aliveness to take root. So as a solution, I would say that it's important for us to protect sex workers, to pay creatives and educators and recruit Black trans staff in any ways that we can. I know that it's very important for us to do so in a vocational setting, even though that might risk the positionality and power that we have in our own vocational worlds. So if I had to get into my own margins about what this might look like, I would say that you could donate to groups like the Black Liberation Collective, the group that I'm from, because we go ahead and provide stipends to Black trans folks, because we know that many of the people that we work with in our organization don't have access to traditional work. We also know that you can get your gifts from Black trans creatives. Holiday season is coming up. There's Etsy shops, there's Instagram pages. I know that y'all can find folks that you can intentionally invest your money in. If you're gonna be splurging your money, go ahead and support Black trans folks in whatever vocations that you can find them. And giving Black trans people power in vocational spaces, because as one of my aunties will say, representation without power is just a target. I'm gonna run that back. Representation without power is a target. So if Black trans people don't have power in their vocational settings and just in general in the ways that we show up, the representation that we think that we are giving them and the things that we think that they're achieving in terms of representation are absolutely just a target on their back. So it means actually waging power in any way that you can. So write down whatever roles or goals or final notes that you have. And I'm gonna go ahead and transition us into some activity since. I oftentimes start in like a mind space and a learning space and a thinking space, but I know that Black trans aliveness isn't just about like notes and historical data and different analyses and different numbers. I know that a lot of this is also in a heart space and it's in an imagination space about how we can actualize this. Because it's not just about what we know, it's also about what we can envision and what we can embody. So I want us to start to turn from your notes to just a bigger question about what you think our world would be like if we seriously invest in all solutions for Black trans aliveness. And you can put that in the chat box. You can go ahead and you can write that down in your notes if you would like to, but I want you to just spend some time thinking about what our world would really be like if we invested in these solutions for Black trans aliveness. Again, what would this world be like if we seriously invested in solutions for Black trans aliveness? I underlined it seriously because I want us to think about what if we radically committed ourselves, not just as we pose them as ideas, but if we all actually took this as our own practice. And not just, I circled solutions in this sense because I don't want it to just be something that sounds good or something that just feels like it's a band-aid. I want it to truly be a remedy. Coming back to some of the questions I see in the chat box as well, just to verbalize them. Victoria was from Benin and then was taken up to Portugal. I think if you type in Victoria, Black trans, Portugal, history, any of those words in Google, I usually can find some information about her pretty easily. And the Colonizer Diaries, that's just what I called it. I'm dramatic. It's not actually a book, but that if you find information about Victoria, you can find information about people like Eleno and Elena, some of the people in South America and the New World that were the voyage of Christopher Columbus had written about in their colonizer diaries. So yeah, it's just like a phrase that I use for all of the colonizer things that I pulled myself into for research. And for folks looking for the Black Liberation Collective, I invite you to email me more or in the handout that we have at the final part of our presentation. I'll share that then. I'm loving the things that I'm seeing in the chat about what our world would be like. All right. I want you to write down some of your final ideas about what this world might be like. But more specifically, I'm going to start to guide us through a visualization practice that will root us more into our goals. I want you to get comfortable. I want you to soften your eyes, but make sure that you feel comfortable in being able to jot down all of the ideas that are coming up for you. I want you to take a breath and think about a child today that's near and dear to you, or an idea of your descendant, and that child's child, and that child's child, and that child's child. And think about 100 years from now, what the youth might look like and live like. and think about all the Black trans liberation that's happened between now and then that connects y'all in a really profound way. I want you to think about some of the things that you see and that you hear and that you smell, and ultimately just what it feels like to be in this really resilient, regenerative, loving future world. What things are like in your home, who's part of your family and your community, what kind of foods you have access to, and the music that you have, and the dance that you have, and the work that you see, and how work is organized, or if it's paid or if it's not, and what kind of transit and transportation we have to and from these spaces, and the different kinds and ways of learning and education that you see, and maybe how decisions are made, and how conflict is resolved, how people relate to each other, or their roles in our ritual and ceremony. And think of any words or phrases or key images that really, really stand out for me. And just take another breath. Imagine in more detail. And now I want you to start to write down a goal that feels like you can actualize this world. And it can be as deep or shallow as you feel like you're ready for. Of course, I want it to be profound, but I also want it to be something that's meaningful. And I think that we've often heard of like SMART goals, goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, timely. It's basically an acronym that just sharpens your goal. And I want you to write down a goal that is a SMART goal. So, for example, if my goal was like, oh, I want to donate to Black trans folks, I could make that more of a SMART goal by making it more specific. Each month, I want to donate $50 to Black trans folks up until the end of the year. And then from after that, I'll like come up with a new goal. Or I will donate $50 to the Black Liberation Collective, and I'll find a friend who can match my donation. I want you to start from whatever goal that you have and just make it a little bit sharper, make it a little bit more smart. And I can't come without a little pizzazz. Of course, I got to put y'all on a little something else if you haven't been put onto it already. But I also like to encourage folks to make smart tea goals. Smarty like the candy, which also means you make it inclusive and equitable. Again, we're talking about Black trans folks, but there are Black trans folks who face poverty in different ways than other folks do. There are Black trans folks who are disabled and face disability issues in ways that not everybody else does in this world. So also challenge your goal and challenge yourself to see if this world that you're living into and the way that you want to actualize that world, is that actually going to include all Black trans people? Yeah, stop shopping at Hobby Lobby. Exactly. And like other stores, or maybe you can try to find if somebody else that you know usually shops there, put them on, make sure that they know about it. I'm always trying to campaign to people, y'all. This hate chicken, these waffle fries, I know they got somewhere better. I know they got somewhere better. I'll start making y'all the waffle fries if Chick-fil-A means this much to you, but we have to stop investing in them. So yeah, take some time to think about a goal that can actualize this world and really how you can challenge yourself. And I know that it's most important that these are goals that you can put into action, because it's a matter of aliveness or death. It's not just like it would be cool if you could do this. Every single day that passes on is another day that my Black trans people are subjugated to harm and violence and inequity and injustice. And I can't afford to lose a single other one of them. So these goals that you're creating, of course, yes, there's pressure, and I don't want you to feel trapped by that pressure. But rather than it holding you back, the pressure of that, I want that to be power and like support and affirmation that the things that you do have meaning and impact. So rather than that letting you feel intimidated from the get-go, I encourage you to just feel like that's pushing you from behind, because it's truly a matter of aliveness or death. Somebody said in the chat, I ain't Chick-fil-A, but when are you making them waffle fries? You know what? We're about to wrap up. In fact, we're at the end of our presentation pretty soon, so I can pop them in the air fryer, put a little pizzazz in them. And as you're writing these goals, if you're not feeling like this is the time or space, or if you like know that you can write a little something more profound, a little bit more smarty and tuned, then come back to it. But wherever you are now, I want you to just pause and know that like there's not a single one of us that has the singular answer or the singular role or the goal that we're going to start showing up as. So put your perfectionism to the side. That's also something else that came out from this colonial legacy we're trying to uproot altogether. So put that perfectionism somewhere else and start here, and set a reminder for yourself 1 month from today about how you can make sure that you're still accountable to this goal. So in the example I used, a month from today, I'm going to be like, hey, did you still really donate like you said you were going to? You can write that down. If you've got like a physical planner, write it in there, put it in your phone calendar. Sometimes people will also like auto send a text to themselves or auto send an email to themselves a month out. But I encourage you to put as much of that goal as you can, because if it just says Black Trans Aliveness a month from now, you're going to be like, child, what? Whatever that means, and you're going to keep it pushing. So help future you out, but also make sure that future you is accountable even a year out from now. My favorite challenge is not only to see what you can do a month from today, it's still fresh in your mind. Hopefully you can still hear a little bit of me in your head in a month from now, but a year out from now, that's really saying something. How committed are you really going to be to Black Trans Aliveness? And if you're not, if you're falling off after a couple weeks, a couple months, what does that really mean to Black Trans Aliveness as well, you know? Really start to question what your accountability means, but also what the absence of your accountability means. Now, in this 90 minutes, there's no other way that we could say it all, do it all. So one of the things that I offer to y'all is to continue your learning and your accountability to Black trans folks. If you would like to book a consultation with me, if this could be anything from, I would like to show up better in my own interpersonal relationships and family members, I have time and space for that. If this could mean, hey, there's some policy that I have at work and it is messy and I need somebody with the mindset who can do it to come in and pick it apart and tell us what we got to change and what we got to write differently, to I want to know more about that book, or can I have access to that slide? You can set up a one-on-one, or I'm also going to put my email here in the chat box. If you would like to do that, I'll put it in here again. I can do team group conversations. Truly, I'm open for most things, and I'll absolutely let you know if it's not within my capacity or skill set, or I love to put other Black trans folks on. So even though if I feel like I could have the capacity, if I really know somebody else in my community could eat it up, I'm gonna put them on as well, or try to figure out a way to do it together meaningfully. There's also a QR code on your screen that takes you to a Drive folder. This is one part of the Drive folder, but it's essentially an info sheet that I created where y'all can continue your learning and continue deepening your accountability to Black trans aliveness. So if you want to know more about some of what these terms are or what they mean, this is a great resource for you, and I encourage you to save it after the screen changes, because there's ongoing reflection prompts and some books and some terms, some questions that you can have. It's got the Black Liberation Collective Venmo that I keep trying to shamelessly plug. There's some offerings. If maybe setting a role or goal was difficult for you, there's some roles or goals that you could have on here. It's also got some shows, some films, documentaries, quotes, podcasts. I really try to do it all. So I encourage you to use that and to share that. Like, you're not cheating in the terms of Black trans aliveness. The more people you can share this out to, the better. That's exactly what we're doing, is sharing our work in this, because we all know that we have to do the work. So we might as well do it together. So I feel like in terms of doing it together and making sure that folks don't feel like they're stranded alone, the last part of this that I wanted to make space for is a Q&A. So if there are any questions that you have of ways that you can feel supported in doing this work together or starting to unpack some of these ideologies for yourself or whatever goals that you might have, I'm going to go ahead and turn my attention to the chat box on my screen now and verbalize any of them that I can verbalize with our remaining time. I also know that it's very likely that I missed a question earlier in the chat, so feel free to copy and paste it at the bottom again for me.
Hey, Nish. This is Araba. Just coming on to, so I don't have a question, I have a comment, and I feel like it was too much to type.
Yeah, go for it, of course.
So I love how you talked about the fetishization piece, and you mentioned Renaissance, and I thought that was like a perfect example and something that my friend and I were actually discussing earlier, right? And we love how Beyonce has been able to like amplify the LGBT community and culture, but we did notice it I think there were some aspects to that that kind of seemed more of like performative solidarity versus anything. So like, what are your thoughts on that?
Child, you gonna get me on the Beehive. Okay, first of all, my disclaimer is Beehive, I was there. So just know that like whatever I say, take it with a grain of salt. I was going bar for bar. I was there for it all. So let me just start with that. But I will also say that one of my very first thoughts. So there I am, boom, I'm chilling, hanging out with my friends. We know that Beyonce's dropping this album. Bam, it's out. We're listening to it. We're screaming, crying. Oh my gosh, everyone's freaking out, right? And we listen to it, and I'm sitting there to myself. I'm enjoying it. I'm having a great time, but I'm also thinking, what are the impacts of this album going to be? Because there's people like Beyonce with the immense social platform that she has, not only in this nation, but across the world. And like, what is going to be the legacy when this badass trans, very, very queer, very, 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 very queer album hits the main stage? And what's it going to be like when we hit pop culture main stage? So there's two main things that I'll share with you. These are kind of like the TED Talks that I've been having in my head that are still developing. The first one that I think of is something that Dr. Angela Davis actually said in the workshop that we shared together, the story circle that we shared together in 2021. She was talking about the role that we have as organizers and advocates and the people in these movements to let things go main stage and to like put them into the mainstream. And whether it's these terms, whether it's certain ideologies, eventually they're going to get dissipated. They're going to be taken away from us. Like, for example, everybody and their mama probably thinks they're a revolutionary right now, or like we'll call it like abolition, but it's truly just like a reformist approach. A lot of the times, sometimes like certain words or concepts, things, they just go main stage and they completely get ripped from their community or from their meaning. And of course, we have to be here stewards of that. We're trying to confront that. We're trying to make sure that there's alignment. But we also have this role and this goal to like know that we are the creators. And that like as many times as we continually can create as much as we're like losing something or it's going main stage. And y'all, by no means am I doing her any justice in the ways that I'm summarizing this. But I guess the way that I've held it or the way that I've internalized it is that, yes, in this specific example, Beyonce's Renaissance has given sacred, queer, trans moments, hype, beauty, all of these things to the entire world. And there is a lot of like scarcity and panic that comes from me because I'm like, it's losing its flavor, it's losing its meaning, it's losing its this. And I also know that we are constant producers. We are infinite, we are abundant. And that is something that doesn't mean that we should be tapped into like an infinite resource, but also is something that we know that is our challenge to protect that, to preserve that, to reclaim that, to hold that with honor, but also to know that there's no way that it can ever be taken from us because we are the thing. We are the thing. So there's that I've been thinking about, and that whole concept I've been framing. But I also think a lot about Paris is Burning, which is this older documentary. If y'all haven't been put on, Paris is Burning is something y'all can stream. but it's a documentary that really talks about like the ball scene, the drag scene in New York in like the 80s and 90s. And that piece is beautiful in so many ways. It's like the first way that I know so many of us are finding ourselves and finding our representation. It's which what a lot of Pose was based off of. It's there's so many important moments in that that put us onto a national stage, an international stage. There's people like Madonna who came out with her voguing song. There's so many things that like added power. And I say that to say that like we don't need affirmation from this outside world for us to be beautiful and profound. And there are so many things that just get completely like whitewashed through that becoming main stage. It's something that becomes internet slang because it hits the main stage. And so there's so much of our roots that have been uprooted. So there's also a lot of harm that came from that because I know that Beyonce did pay a lot of the trans folks and the queer folks who put her on and who harnessed the foundation of this album. But I also know in a really similar way that Paris is Burning, like, did not compensate people the ways that it needed to be compensated. And if it did, it was the most mere percentage of all percentages that could have been given. And I also know the way that it was marketed to people in Paris is Burning was not the way that it was marketed in to the rest of the world. So a lot of these people thought they were participating in this really beautiful, sacred way, and then it was completely taken from them and basically shown as like, look what they're doing over here. Look at these poor, poor people that we need to save. So there's also like a lot of savior complex that stems from this. And I feel like I'm answering this question in so many ways. So I think that if I had to summarize between my Dr. Davis ideas, but also like my Paris is Burning ideas, I would say all of this to say that it is really complex. It is beautiful with the caveat that we're holding it with integrity and with the idea that we're intentional about preserving this and creating more of this into the world. This can't just be a one-off that gets celebrated. Um, but yeah, thank you for doing that. Beehive, please don't come for me. I don't need this energy. Um, I know that we can be vicious sometimes. I also see the comment that's in the chat box that I'll speak to just a little bit to make space for other folks to have questions. Somebody said that they would love to know what it is like to unpack and invest in what Black trans aliveness could be like in early education. And I think that this is like, I feel like the older person I'm like, I don't know. It's almost like cliche. It's like this Facebook thing that's always being rebranded. But like if you're old enough to experience it, you're old enough to learn about it. It's specifically being used a lot and reshared through the aunties as they're talking about critical race theory. And I love that. Um, and I think that that's very important. Like I know at any age, we can have these ideas about Black trans folks. And so for some people, that could mean things like young folks, as they're coming up into the world, they're learning language and they're trying to figure out um, like who to refer to their family members as. So that could be a meaningful conversation with you and your siblings or your family or whoever it might be for your descendants and for children to figure out, okay, well, what term do I call them? If it's not in a gender binary like auntie or uncle or sister or brother, if there are terms that feel affirming to your loved relatives and your loved ones, that feel affirming to them, that could be a way that you have these conversations. There are also books, children's books that I feel like I love that as an idea. But I also know that like in a classroom setting, it could mean all sorts of things. I know that we typically will like be very much so in this mindset of young boys and young girls when we're talking about early learners. So I think that it's very important for us to just, ask open-ended questions about like, like what's your name? What name do you like to be called? Um, I mean, I don't know if young folks will really understand the concept of pronouns, but they absolutely understand pronouns and just like how to refer to folks. So there's so many ways that we can get into like, well, what kind of things do you like to play with? And what kind of things do you enjoy? And well, that's silly. You don't have to like blue just because you're a boy, but I like that you like blue. There's so many ways that we can reframe these ideas in a really positive way that deconstructs this idea of transphobia or this legacy of racism that we hold through without expecting like a 5-year-old to get pronouns. Because it's not just about words and it's not just about memorizing. It's about having an entire perspective that leaves room for Black trans people to be exactly who they are. Um, We've got about another 5 minutes or so, which the rate I'm going is enough for me to answer 1 to 2 more questions at most. But if somebody doesn't have a question and maybe they have a goal, I'd be happy to find one goal that I can help sharpen. So yeah, either one question or goal that I can help close out with before I cede my time back to y'all to go start waging Black trans aliveness into this world. Thank you for the love, Alo. I'm gonna go ahead, thank you so much in the chat. I'm gonna go ahead and stay on for up until the time is gone. So I welcome you to email me, stay in touch with me. If there's anything else that I can do for you, I would love to be of service to you because that means I'm being of service to my people and my aliveness. So stay in touch. Folks, if you have a question, I'll stay on. But other than that, have a beautiful day and thank you so much for joining this presentation. Stay on for the rest of the series so you can learn more from the other amazing folks that Ujima has consulted with for this series. Yes, wage and waffle fries. That's what the movement's gonna be fed on, y'all. Mark my words, the fuel of the revolution.
Yeah, so we're just going to continue to give folks the time to think about any last question or last goals, as you said.
Yes.
And also, as you all are thinking about any last questions, comments, or goals, as Nish requested, please do not forget to join us for today's workshop in the afternoon. We have Chastity Parrish presenting on cultural liberation and how to practice and improve self-care. I think this is a great extension of what we learned here today. So
Yes, get into it, y'all. And if you're like me, if you can't make it in real time, catch the recording later and make sure that you're connected with Ujima so you can get that recording.
absolutely, absolutely. All right. Well, it looks like that may be. Yes, Jocelyn, they will be made available. Well, I want to take this time to thank Nish Newton for joining us today and giving such an awesome, awesome workshop.
Thank you.
I think you saw firsthand, this was super educational, super informative. So we are so grateful for all of the knowledge that you dropped on us today. And please do not go far because we are going to be
Please, I'm hungry for it.
Yeah, I think this is the first step in creating tangible solutions like you spoke to earlier. It's just that education piece. So thank you once again. We would love to invite you guys back this afternoon at 3 p.m. And we are going to have a workshop presentation on self-care. You do not want to miss it at all. So thank you all for joining today and see you later.
Yes, see you soon. 3 p.m. Eastern.
Eastern Standard Time, correct.
Yes, be there. You won't want to miss it.
Yes.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.